In terms of just where the Chinese are going and what they are doing, are there any particular areas that raise the most immediate national security concerns?
Yeah. So one of the things to keep in mind is that when the Chinese talk about space, they're not just talking about space. They are very holistic in their view. So they talk about establishing space dominance, but to them, space dominance means not just what's in orbit, but also terrestrial ground facilities, launch facilities, mission control facilities, and then the data links that tie it all together. So we have watched the Chinese now, for example, build a huge station down in Argentina. It's supposed to be space surveillance, it's supposed to watch space. Apparently the Argentines aren't allowed in except at predetermined times. This is a facility the Chinese built in Argentina, supposedly cooperative. So one of the things to keep in mind is that China is using its space program to build facilities on Earth in places that in the past it hasn't had access to. Another thing to keep in mind is that China is pushing the development of robotic satellites, service satellites. So these are dual use. They can go and refuel your satellite, repair your satellite, but if I can repair or refuel your satellite, I can also tear it apart. And then the third thing that the Chinese are doing is that they tested an anti-satellite weapon aimed at geosynchronous space. If you look at all of the various orbits out there, one of the most valuable is what's termed geosynchronous. If you put a satellite in that position, it stays over the same spot on Earth.
For example, this radio program is being transmitted right now by signals from a satellite that's 22,500 miles up, and it stays over the same spot on Earth. So please continue.
Exactly. So communication satellites live out there, some weather satellites live out there, and missile early warning and detection satellites live out there. This is how we would know if the United States was under attack. One of the things we and the Soviets pretty much agreed on during the Cold War was this.
You keep in mind these are really way out there. This is an order of magnitude more difficult to get to. You stop and think 22,500 miles, and the International Space Station is what, a couple hundred miles up?
Yeah, about I want to say about 600 miles up.
About 600 exactly. Miles up. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's vastly further out. So we're talking about a capability that is far different from things in lower Earth orbit. In fact, 22,500 miles. That's a tenth of the way to the moon. So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And nobody else has ever tested weapons against those satellites because it strikes at strategic stability. It strikes at key things that nobody really wants to mess around with. But the Chinese have tested out there.
1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4627. As we note the Chinese efforts in outer space. The Chinese, of course, have been notorious in recent years for signing agreements and then flouting them, agreements to not manipulate their currency, but they do it anyway, agreements to protect intellectual property, but they do it anyway. Are there any international agreements that their space program is flouting?
Actually, no, mostly because there aren't that many international agreements right now governing space, and the ones that are there are very, very broad and very, very open to interpretation. By the way, an apology to your listeners. I was wrong earlier. The International Space Station actually goes out to about 250 miles.
Okay.
No, the Chinese, there are no prohibitions about deploying weapons in space. The Outer Space Treaty says you can't deploy weapons of mass destruction. So the one limitation is you can't deploy nuclear weapons and, I suppose, chemical and biological. And as far as we know, nobody really violates that because there's no real need to do that. But so far, the Chinese basically have been doing exploration. There's no obligation for them to reveal the things they find scientifically. It's more a matter of courtesy and custom. That could change, of course, once the Chinese start landing more things on the moon or deploying their space station, which they are expected to do in the next couple of years. Or in the event of a conflict, of course, it'll be really interesting to see what the Chinese might do in space.
To say the least, certainly will be. When did the Chinese space program really get going? I mean, you go back to the heyday of the space race, as it were. The Russians put up Sputnik, and we're late there, but we finally joined them in Earth orbit, and then of course we beat them on the push to get to the moon. After which we didn't hear a great deal more about the space program, really. It sort of ceased to be part of the public consciousness. And all the while, the Europeans have a space agency, and they were putting up satellites in Earth orbit, Sputnik-level stuff. And China? I mean, granted, today you've got all kinds of nations out there. I think Israel's had satellites up, and Iran and India. But when did the Chinese become so big in space? That sort of sneaked up on me.
So the Chinese became interested in space in 1958. Think about that.
That's a year after Sputnik.
Exactly. Mao Zedong said, if other countries are going to do space, then we need to put up our own satellites. Now, keep in mind, in 1958, the China that he was talking about was a country that was dirt poor, that was 80% illiterate, that could not build its own car. So at the time, everyone sort of said, wow, you are just so delusional. 12 years later, China launches its first satellite, 1970. And then their space program kind of went into hibernation because, again, it was still a poor country. So really we should date today's space program from the mid-90s, when the Chinese suddenly concluded space is the gateway to the future, and poured money into R&D, into building a space industrial complex. And today, just to give you a sense of comparison, China can launch its own astronauts into space. Europe cannot. And we only literally just got back into launching our own astronauts up this year, thanks to Elon Musk and SpaceX.
So in terms of a government entity, we still can't. And haven't been since the space shuttle.
That's right.
Yeah.